Now, with all this context, can we really take credit for our own personality and our own decisions? How much of our personality can be product of our genetics or the things that we already have? Now, I would love to bring Ayn Rand to the 21st century. Now that
I'd like to meet her.
Right, yeah, and like expose her to like like different debates that we now have. And one of the things that will intrigue me is that now you can test your DNA to know your ancestry and also like your health, and they can tell you if you are more if you have in your genetics the probabilities of getting cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer or Parkinson's. And we are learning that in the genetic process, we not only inherit like the color of our eyes from our parents, but that sexuality, for example, our sexual desires are also something that come, it's not like the religious views thought before that, oh my God, these are sinners that go anti-nature. No, it turns out that it is part of the nature of the human being, the diversity in sexuality. We now know these things, but we still don't know how much of that determines our character, our personality. And I know that in recent books, Steven Pinker is almost saying that free will doesn't exist, which actually contradicts things that he wrote here in The Blank Slate, right? Because in this book, for example, he starts saying, this is not going to be one of those books that says that everything is genetic, because it isn't. The environment is just as important as the genes. The things children experience while they're growing up are just as important as the things they're born with. But I think that the problem that we're now facing, and which I would like, for Ayn Rand to be here and tell us, is that we cannot really categorize which things are those that could be genetically, passed from your parents. For example, propensity to adrenaline. Chemically, there are more people propense to adrenaline rushes, and that makes them more propense to be drug addicts or casino players or to jump from parachutes, whereas there are people that know, or even cheaters in their love relationships, right? And they might take irrational decisions because of that. Now, I am not a determinist. I do not believe that genes will determine our destiny, because that's like, right, like thinking of a God that it's already making the decisions for us. But I am really intrigued in the findings that our DNA can teach us, not only of the diseases, but also mentally. So what would Ayn Rand say about, are we all blank slates? Do we inherit certain personality traits from our parents?
So there's, I have a friend who does research in psychology, and she brought to my attention some work that's been done recently by other psychologists in the field of what they call behavioral genetics.
Right.
And one of the things that they usually like to study, and it's kind of the gold standard for questions, studying questions like this, is twin studies. So you take some twins, identical twins, who obviously have pretty much the same genetics, and who, in most cases, were actually raised by the same parents in the same environment. So you're holding fixed both genetics and environmental influences.
Right.
And the interesting thing about a lot of these studies is that there are still things that identical twins, even when they're raised in the same circumstances, will end up doing differently from each other. They'll end up making different choices from each other. And some scientists have actually figured out ways of quantifying how much of the differences between the two of them you can account for using either genetic or some other environmental differences that might exist between the two of them. There's a paper from year 2000 by Turkheimer and Waldron, which is important on this. But what they found is that something like 40 to 60% of the differences that you find between identical twins in regard to behavior traits, character traits and behavioral differences, there's no way of accounting for by reference to either genetics or environment. Turkheimer says if you're going to look for free will, it's in this what he calls non-shared environment where it's going to be. And he says leave it to the philosophers to figure out what free will is and what it means, but there's certainly nothing in current behavioral genetics that allows us to explain all of the differences between individuals in this regard.
Right.
And the idea of a blank slate, I think one has to be careful and distinguish two things. And I don't think in Steven Pinker's book, these are distinguished very well, and really they're run together. So you can talk about a blank slate, and this, I think in philosophy, what is meant, and this is what Ayn Rand means when she talks about that you are tabula rasa, which is the Latin for a blank slate.
Yeah.
It's that there's no content in your mind prior to your senses, and then your thinking process is working. So you're not born with any ideas. So there used to be a view in philosophy that you have innate ideas, so that you somehow inherit, or at birth you have content in your mind. And she's rejecting that, and I think rightly she's rejecting that your mind starts working and you become conscious only when your senses start working. And prior to that, there's no content in your mind. But so to say that is not the same as saying, so the other kind of view that blank slate often means is there's no innate structure. There's no identity in the end. Your mind has no nature.
Silly putty is what he compares.
Yes, yeah. And that's trying to get, like, it has no characteristics, it has no structure. All that comes after birth, and that's not true. And Ayn Rand did not think that is true at all. She compared the mind at birth to like a complex camera. So it has a real structure, it has all kinds of capacities or potentialities. But for that to become active, you need the actual experience to start happening. But I mean, parents report from very early on at birth that different kids have different moods and different temperament. That's not the same as saying they have different content or they were born with some different content. It's just they respond to their experiences in a different way. And it might be because there's differences in adrenaline. There can be, I mean, I think that's a scientific question to then investigate all
because
that.
you say we don't have inherent ideas. For example, no kid is born believing in a God. That is something that is inputted.
Yes.
But are we born with certain moods, or are we born with certain talents or characteristics that will differentiate us in the long run into becoming a piano player or a medicine doctor? Does she make any differentiation in between having certain talents that could come from what your parents or your grandparents did before? Like, for example, can you tell, like, if you come from a family where there are actors or actresses, and then the kids also go into that business road, you can never tell, was it the environment that they were exposed to or not, right?